Okay, we're going to get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Jessica Weis. I'm the new program director for Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy's Women in Energy initiative. We envision a world where there is equal gender representation at all levels within the energy sector. Our mission is to elevate all underrepresented groups in the energy workforce with a focus on women by sharing research, expanding the pipeline, and supporting professionals. The 27th United Nations COP, or Conference of Parties, begins on Sunday. In advance of COP, we wanted to discuss how and why it is so critical to put gender at the center of climate negotiations. Before we get into this important topic, let me quickly say that this event is being webcast live, and the full video will be available online in coming days. You can submit a question for the panelists at any time by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And as a reminder, our events are closed caption. You can turn on the captions on by clicking the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen and then selecting show subtitles. I am thrilled to introduce our panelists for this conversation, Amy Jaffe, Catherine McKenna, and Irina Lazzarini. Amy will be our moderator and is the co-chair of the Women in Energy Initiative at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia. Catherine McKenna is a distinguished visiting fellow at the Center on Global Energy Policy, founder and principal of Climate and Nature Negotiations, the former Minister of Environment, Climate Change and Infrastructure of Canada, and chair of the UN Secretary General's high-level expert group on the net zero commitments of non-state entities. Irina Lazzarini is the principal specialist of clean energy at Sustainable Energy for All. Irina supports climate diplomacy and the just energy transition with countries in Africa and Asia. Amy, I hand it over to you.
Well, it's really an honor to be moderating today and to be with these two highly distinguished women who are in the trenches working on the global climate problem, engaging with countries around the world, and doing so in a manner that really takes into consideration women at the center of both climate diplomacy and at the center of climate impact. Some academic research studies have shown that upwards of 80% of people dislocated by climate events are women and girls. And so it's a very important topic that we're addressing today in thinking about what contribution women leaders make in coming up with solutions and also having a gendered response, mainstreaming climate change diplomacy. So I'm going to be officiating a moderated discussion today. I'm going to start with a few questions to tee up our panel, but that I encourage all of you who are viewing this to submit your questions and thoughts into the Q&A, and that way I will be able to bring them to our distinguished panelists. So I'm going to begin by noting that the Center on Global Energy Policy published a paper a few weeks ago that was anchored by a young woman working as a summer intern at Columbia at SIPA, Callie Nathanson. And it was called Women and Gender in Climate Diplomacy. And it outlined the sort of research and evidence that about women and girls and how they are disproportionately affected by climate change. And then talking about the integration of women's voices into climate negotiations and climate solutions, especially Indigenous voices. So I'd like to ask our two panelists, just to get us started, Catherine and Irina, to what extent have women and other voices, Indigenous voices, been included in negotiations that you've been involved in or activity you've been involved in? And how do you see the gender makeup of those activities influencing conversations and outcomes? Catherine, why don't we start with you?
Sure. There's two ways to answer it. One, it's been terrible. And two, there are good examples. So when I think about women, so first of all, at the highest level, when I started at COP21, there are loads of women who weren't there explicitly because they were women, just because they were kick-ass. So you saw women like Laurence Toubiana, who is France's lead negotiator. You saw Christiana Figueres, who was head of the COP, but you also, the executive secretary of the COP, but you also saw a lot of other women, from Mary Robinson, who was focused on climate justice, to Sharon Burrows, who was focused on labor rights, a lot of women ministers who were there, women who are running environmental organizations, Indigenous women, but those were, not necessarily directly in the negotiations. So directly at the negotiations, we just have a gender problem, just a normal gender problem, i.e. there isn't 50% women, even though there's been a commitment to that at the negotiations. And actually they do, the UN women, they have a focal point, and they have noticed that men, not only are women just not represented, especially as lead negotiators, that men speak twice as long. So I thought that was quite good. But if you're actually talking about Indigenous women or women from, from local communities, grassroots women, I mean, they even have a hard time just getting to COP. I think we're seeing that it's a challenge for a lot of people to get to COP. But I mean, these women are actually, often it's beyond their means. They aren't part of the network because it is still an elite network on climate, even if you're including the environmental groups, broader civil society. And by the way, they're just actually trying to do action in their local communities. And that's a real problem, because what I've seen is often there isn't a gender frame or an understanding about how you have to look at climate impacts as well as climate action from a gender. You have to do a gender-based analysis, because otherwise you won't get the outcomes that most people, actually reasonable people, would support. And that's everything. We do a gender-based lens, or we did in Canada. That's everything from looking at how policies might disproportionately impact negatively on women. And we saw that with Indigenous women. We look at climate change, and many of them are women. They are women responsible for medicines. They're responsible for water. They're huge impacts. But globally, if you look at just basic things like women, when you're trying to evacuate a community, it's likely to be women that are caring for children. And they even found, like, if you have an evacuation plan, if you have a bus, and I hate to say it, but the men are likely to rush on the bus, and the women are left there, trying to bring their children, aging parents. So I think that we have to be smarter about this. There is a gender action plan. I'm very proud Canada helped push this within the UN, but it's not only about making sure that women are 50%, representation at all fora, but it's also bringing in women's voices more broadly and making sure it's diversity of women's voices. So not just elite women from developed countries, but also marginalized women, Indigenous women, grassroots women, and really understanding the solutions they're providing, but also the disproportionate impacts they're feeling of climate change.
So Irina, now you've been involved in a recent exercise in this area. Can you tell us about it and elaborate?
Yes, thank you very much, Amy, and also thank you, Catherine. Well, in general, when it comes to climate negotiation on the COP, I tend to agree with Catherine that we are definitely not there. But my very recent examples, it's a bit more about EU negotiations with now 9 countries, and specifically with the Western Balkans and the Eastern countries, Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine, actually. And here I have a very positive example, because the leading negotiator from the EU side were all women who were negotiating the targets up to 2030 for these 9 countries on energy and climate. Both the chief negotiator from the energy side and the one from the climate side were 2 women. And when it comes to the countries themselves, most of the country also had chief negotiators that were women. Not only that, but the 2 co-chairs of the committee that is preparing the old ground for negotiation were also 2 women, actually the Deputy Prime Minister of Ukraine and the Deputy Prime Minister of Serbia. And I think there were a lot of women around the room, but the outcome was quite positive, actually. And I think there are 3 main elements that struck me like very typical being present when women are negotiating. One is the pragmatism. I think that we didn't really lose time. We went straight to the point. It was a very pragmatic discussion. The second one was effectiveness, because we start discussing and preparing the ground for negotiation in early spring 2022. We started with the negotiations in April 2022, and we concluded what is a technical discussion on the targets, on the numbers in mid-July 2022. So it's 2.5 months. It was quite effective. And at the end, 8 out of 9 countries, they agree on the numbers. So I think this is very positive. And then maybe one last point that I think I've seen much more when women are on the lead negotiating rather than men is the empathy. The feeling from both sides that the needs and challenges that the other side is putting forward are really listened to. They're really taken into account. So the negotiation style is a bit more people-centered. And I think these make a really big difference, because the interlocutors are really the impression that the problems and the challenges, especially when it comes to agreeing on very high ambitions on greenhouse gas emission reduction, are actually listened and taken into account. So yeah, this was my very recent experience, which is a positive one. But I know that at the global level, when it comes to COP, it's very, very different, and we're lagging behind.
So I'm going to jump ahead to a question that was put in the chat by Peter McKillop, because it's such a good question. And he mentions that there's a proposal on the table, She Change Climate, to have 50% co-leaders for gender balance. And, you know, Irina, you mentioned this question about, you know, your effort had several leading figures in the delegation being women, either head of delegation or in some kind of leading role. But I've noticed that in my statistics, just working with the statistics, that the number of women who directly get to address the plenary sessions is extremely low. So whereas maybe in some subcommittees and other places, you do have active participation in this general assembly where the media is there and we're focused on the negotiation and people are getting to state their positions and so forth, women are deeply underrepresented. And you know, the question is there a way even to weave in the younger generation of women who are outside, you know, with the signs and impassioned ideas, and Indigenous women? So we're, you know, how do we fix that? And what do you think is the structure of the problem?
Yeah, it's to me, right, Amy?
Yeah,
take it over. Okay.
Well, so, I mean, what I've noticed is just what you've said, Amy, and I mean, I think Irina, you know, I think this is a great initiative, and Women Leading on Climate. I mean, we're certainly very focused on how do we ensure women are in leading roles. But we will see, like, if you look at delegations, you're going to see actually a not surprising breakdown, not only of the fact that it's mainly men that are leading the delegations still, but for certain countries, there just are not women. And if there are women there and they've been told to bring women, they're like bringing water to delegates, to negotiators. And I'm not diminishing those women. They are being diminished by the fact that they aren't being given the opportunity. But that speaks to the need to build a pipeline of women who can demonstrate the skills. And sadly, often women are required to do more to demonstrate skills. We've seen that across the board, not just in climate negotiations, but I think it is really important. It's important for women so that they can be well versed in the topics, but often they are the ones that are able to find solutions, be less dramatic, focus on outcomes as opposed to restating or retrenching, status quo positions. And so that's something that I think there's work going on, but more needs to be done. Also creating networks of women. I think that's critically important, that you can't be like the one woman in your delegation. You need to be connected with other delegations. And that comes with time. If you're a leading woman, if you're the lead negotiator, so in Canada, almost our whole team, well, a very significant number of our team, including our lead negotiator and our climate ambassador, all women. But you need to have you need to have a network of women who are going to support you, and also that you can reach out to, one, to negotiate with, but two, to also feel like you have allies to support you when you're at the table, when the men are taking up more than half the time, more than double the time. So I think structurally, it isn't just, obviously formal gender balance is important, but also ensuring that the structures are in place, that these women are playing leading roles, can contribute. But most important, I'm just outcome-based. I actually believe that women have more ambition. They're more willing to try to think outside the box to find solutions. They're more willing to go have quiet chats with folks as opposed to pounding their fists on the table. I don't want to overgeneralize, but this is my observation. And so I think that we need to really get beyond just saying half women, which we should. By the way, I have no problem with that. I think that should be like, just say half women, and that's the expectation. But we also need to make sure that they're empowered to make a difference at the table, including leading, but also in all roles, because also at climate negotiations, we've been there. You have subgroups. I negotiated the Article 6. You need leading the subgroups as experts. So there's lots of different ways that they can play important roles.
Irina, what's your experience been? I know you've been active with SE for All and other kinds of organizations like that. How do you champion the issues that you want to see come forward?
Yes. I think, my position is very clear and it's very similar to Catherine. It's true. When it comes to, women leading the negotiations, we are really lagging behind, and there are not many women that are in that position there. But yeah, one important element I think that we have to take into account, as Catherine was saying, is to mentor the young generation. They should be mentored to really have a possibility to be on stage. One important element would be also to try as much as possible to focus not only on the constituent bodies of the negotiations, but really on the most important leading position on decision making. I think is there where you really make the difference. Definitely having 50% of women there will be ideal. Right now, we are very far away from that. I think we are probably about 25%. And that changes with every COP. It depends. In the COP26, they were a bit less than COP25, for example. But I think, one thing will be mentoring for young generation. Another important element will be training. Capacity building, it's really the key. It's really important, especially when we want young leaders taking the floor and be prepared, because they have to be engaged, and they have a lot of men that have much more experience, and they are mentors since a longer time. So I think it's important. And then I think that very positive example comes from those countries that have a very strong feminist foreign policy, because in these countries, women tend to be part of multilateral process since a very early age. They create the kind of network that Catherine was mentioning before from a very early age. So when they are in their 40s, for example, they are really leading the negotiations. And this is the case of Mexico, that had women leading the negotiation in 2016, in 2019, and in 2021. And they had very meaningful things to say. For example, stop the gender violence against women, gender equality, women freedom, and many others important elements. So I will maybe, focus on these three elements: the mentoring, the training, but also the importance of underlining feminist foreign policies. And I think this is even more relevant now for countries like Sweden, the United States. I think it's also playing a role when it comes to these, and Germany as well. They are trying to push very much for a feminist foreign policies in order to have more women leading the negotiation at the COPs, for example.
So an interesting thing that's come out in statistical research on women in environmental leadership is that women in foreign policy in the OECD, especially in Europe and places that have parliamentary processes, that women are more apt to vote for foreign aid. And I think that's very important in the context, especially of the COP27 and moving forward, because of course, funding for adaptation and mitigation activities in the global South is a main sticking point for what the path forward is. And so that seems to me, to be a fundamental strength, if that's, women are going to be more effective in allocating finance. You know, that's kind of an interesting observation in terms of their contribution. And I do think you raised this sort of interesting question, which is, how do we mobilize not only funding for, you know, climate assistance, but also how do we make sure that funding goes to is delineated or handed out in a way that is sensitive to the impacts of climate change on women. And then also, you mentioned training. So how do we come up with the funding? I know the UN has some limited funding, but how do we fund to make sure that, like, say, even the side events at the COPs involve women speakers and are highly representative of the global community?
Well, those are all really good questions. So, I mean, I think once again, not surprisingly, women, including women in foreign policy, recognize that they're cross-cutting issues that you have to address. Like we can, and it's actually interesting with this high-level expert group report that we're focused on. Underlying everything, like whether, you know, we're going to get to net zero, is money that we need to be financing the transition. We need to take money at scale, stop funding fossil fuels, and move it to clean energy. In particular, we need to be supporting developing countries, but we also need to be thinking about how to ensure a just and equitable transition, because it's not going to work otherwise. And so that it is interesting that and once again, I hate to overgeneralize, but women have a more nuanced view. And it's not like, you know, binary, you've got to do this, and then, you know, this is going to happen. It's like, okay, a bunch of things need to happen at the same time. And as we know in this COP, like I am very concerned, like many other people, that loss and damages, the pathway to 100 billion, adaptation, finance, that we're not going to be able to, you know, see the financial flows that are needed to ensure the transition is fair and just, but also that happens. And so I think that is really an important point. In terms of, like, you know, so even funding like initiatives like this, it can be challenging. You have to be extremely innovative. Now, I do think that there are a lot of folks who understand this, including companies, but often building these programs requires like figuring out what is their engagement in this? Can they be involved in mentoring? So it's actually, these things alone take a lot of time. And my focus on women leading on climate, as soon as I get of this UN report, I am doing other things with climate and nature, but is really focused on, you know, getting an ED in place who understands all this and can help make creative programs with the impact we need, but with the funding, so you're not doing it all in a shoestring. I will give one funny story. It's not even funny, but it's just interesting how things work. So I was at the COP, would have been maybe 2016. And I asked the UN, I said, like, look, I want to share my time as Canada's national representative or head of delegation with an amazing Inuit woman, because she can do a much better job of explaining the impacts of climate change on her community. And I think it'll be compelling. And they're like, no, you can't do that. And I was like, oh, sorry, why? And they said, well, you know, we just like, you know, that's very challenging. It has to be the person who's representative. So I was like, okay, great. So she just came up with me and I just handed over the time, because it's very hard to enforce things. I did realize never ask for permission. I mean, I kind of did it anyway. So it was retroactively not asking for permission or not hearing the no. But I think that we're all going to have to push. These things aren't going to happen by chance. And I feel like sometimes we don't even have time to have these conversations. Like, why am I having a conversation about whether I can share my time? I'm like, gosh, we just actually need to get action, and we need to motivate people to act. And we need people who are telling us about what's really happening, and then being kind of like pretty blunt about what needs to be done. And often women are uniquely placed. This young woman who's an Inuk, like, she's talking about the impacts on her communities in very real ways. Meanwhile, everyone's like mitigation, adaptation, you know, net zero, like no one knows what everyone's talking about. And she's like, this is real, folks. This is what we need to do.
Irina, you want to elaborate on that? I'm sure you've had similar kinds of experiences.
Yes, I think, I mean, what Catherine is saying is true. It's Indigenous people and the women that are working very closely with local communities that know the best, and they know what are the needs and what is the climate needs of the local communities. And I think this is important. We really have to link the climate finance with gender, and we really have to put an emphasis on gender budgeting. These two elements should be prominent at COP27, and I know that they will be discussed quite at the very beginning. And it will be a lot of young women that will bring forward these instances, especially coming from Africa. The African leaders will put these 27 questions, and most of these questions will be focusing about climate and the link with gender and climate and gender budgeting. But also what Catherine was mentioning, so the just and equitable transition, which also includes a very strong gender dimension. And yeah, I mean, I think at local level, the only possibilities to make things happen is that, yeah, if we come up with very concrete plans, and I think these just transition plans, this is what it is about, right? We have to have a clear idea of what we want to achieve, but also we need a clear idea of the impact assessment of that. So how much we need to implement that. And we have, yeah, young activists like Vanessa Nakate and many others that are actively looking for solutions for the African continent, which is, of course, the focus. And just to look into the finance and the renewable energy sectors, apart the promise of the 100 billion that wasn't really maintained, because less than 80 billion were actually delivered to the global south. There is also the issues of the general renewable energy investment, which is really the key to transition from the traditional system towards a clean and just energy transition. And here, 2.8 trillion US dollars were actually mobilized by the international community, private sectors, multilateral banks, but of these only 2% went to the African continent. So there is definitely a gender dimension, and there is also a global south dimension, and there is an important focus that have to be reconciled also when it comes to the importance of the African continent to mobilize for their finance. And I think women are playing a key role into that.
So I mean, I think that's a really important point in sort of merging together both of your points. I mean, COP27 is a unique opportunity because it is on the African continent. Presumably, we're going to have a high attendance and high side events and high participation from speakers and experts from the African continent. And, you know, Catherine, I really love your story. And the reason I love your story is that if I look over the participants list today and I think about my own dialogue and your own dialogue and Irina's work, you know, we have a lot of male allies in this cause at the UN and beyond, in the US delegation and so forth. So, you know, let me call on someone who happens to be in a dialogue with John Kerry and other people who will be prominent voices at COP27 to cede their time, some of their time in the plenaries and in other venues to Indigenous voices and to women voices, right? Because I absolutely believe, Catherine, that your experience actually, you know, not to be so academically oriented, but the statistics actually show that women like Catherine, who are leading a delegation or in a leading role in countries, actually have more connection to community leaders and Indigenous leaders than male leaders do. I mean, that's just a factual statistic, right? But our male leaders also are becoming very educated on these issues related to climate justice. And therefore, it would be great to see more male leaders stand up at COP27 and cede some of their time to these very important speakers that are on the ground and understand these many issues and how they affect women and what is the role for Indigenous communities. So, Catherine, in that regard, I think you're, you know, sort of really well placed, and you've just done this amazing report with so many different voices, and I can imagine how challenging that was to write about net zero in context with so many voices to bring together. So one of the interesting things that's happening now in the sort of offsets voluntary space, and in, you know, because net zero, of course, we're talking about trying to tee up negative emissions and removals. is that the market itself, the voluntary market itself, is starting to value for co-benefits. And one co-benefit, of course, is a positive impact on gender-related issues. And you would think that we're starting to see that removal programs or offset programs that disproportionately harm women would be undervalued in the market. Can you talk a little bit about how you see, sort of net zero activities by corporations and governments, and what will someday be compliance markets versus voluntary markets? How do we square up this idea that co-benefits have a value?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, it should be obvious to folks that, I literally, I'm just outcomes based. So I think often you're spending time explaining why gender matters, gender-based analysis, women. But I mean, it's just if you actually want to tackle climate change in a way that's going to ensure a sustainable future for all, there is no leaving out women. And to be honest, if you want to reach the ambition, you need to include women. The challenge is it's easier said than done. I mean, look, you can see the negative impacts. I mean, look at the credit markets, the voluntary carbon markets. There are real challenges around integrity. And you've seen that, often they have real impacts, sometimes unintended consequences, but I'm sorry, we can't allow those to happen either. That's why, I mean, there needs to be more integrity brought to these voluntary carbon markets. But, there'll be credits related to, but someone told me bringing non-Indigenous trees into a less developed country to get credits, but that have the impact of taking a land away that is necessary for food while we're in the middle of a food crisis. I don't know, that's maybe an extreme case, but there are a number of cases like this where, if you just did basic research, you would understand that was, obviously going to be a problem. On the positive side, though, what I have seen with the leaders on net zero, so we're looking at commitments by non-state actors. So that's companies, financial institutions like banks, insurance companies, and cities and regions, that the ones that are the leaders, and in fact, actually, including in business, making money, are the ones that recognize this. They recognize you got to empower women at the boardroom, but you also need to look, as you're trying to decarbonize your supply chain, about what are the solutions and how can you also have a positive impact in the communities that you operate in. And I think that, it requires the diligence. And that's why, a gender-based analysis, maybe it's the worst term because it seems very inaccessible to people, but just thinking about your policies and your decisions and how do they have a differential impact on women and men, and how do you address that? How that can have a really positive impact. Take women that are, businesswomen in communities who are actually providing solutions. I see Padma asked a question. I mean, I'll lead into it a little bit, but, I'm maybe not at the local level, but one of the women who was just named a high-level climate champion for Africa, Bagolo Kenawendo, she started an empowerment group for women entrepreneurs. And it's creating networks, right? Like, once again, going back to skills, networks, promoting these women, using your own platform, that all needs to happen. And many people are in a privileged place. Companies, large multinationals, in a privileged place. But, cities, regions, if you're a mayor, you can make decisions that are going to have a positive impact. If you're, a negotiator, if you're a politician. And so, I mean, we need to be everyone in on this, but we also need people to actually push the envelope. Because I've been told so many reasons why, we all hear the lame-o where everyone's like, well, it's just, we got to find the best talent. I was like, try harder. There's better talent out there. You're just used to dealing with always choosing the same people. And you're not actually, you're not looking for people that, are actually really innovating. Often women in these local communities have to work really hard. They don't have money. They don't have opportunities. So they've got to really find innovative solutions to support their family, to adapt to climate change. And that's where you're going to get both equity, but you're also going to really actually solve problems, which is really what we need to be focused on right now.
Irina, you want to add some insight into that, and especially maybe respond also to Padma's question about do we see leaders at the local level are getting visibility in Africa and Asia, et cetera?
Yeah, actually, replying to this question, I think this COP will be very much Africa-centered, and we will see a lot of leaders from the Africa taking the floor and definitely defining what we discussed before, just an equitable transition for Africa. What I don't see so much when it comes to the climate negotiation is the presence of Asia Pacific. I think it's a bit, maybe because I'm the impression of 1 week in Asia, where it was an energy discussion very much male dominated. But I think, I mean, a bit more prominent role from Asia Pacific, from speakers from Asia Pacific at the highest possible level, that will be needed. Because when we discuss about, problems like access to energy, we focus very much on the African continent, but we forget that there is a lot of millions of people that also lack electricity, for example, in Asia Pacific. And these issues, but also the issues of clean cooking and many others that are very important when it comes to climate as well, they should be prominently brought forward during the discussion at the COP. And I think this is not the case simply because there is a very low representation of women in a leading position from Asia Pacific. Yes, as I said, I think there will be most probably a very strong presence from women from Africa, and the feminist group of women is really mobilizing. They have 27 questions that they will bring forward at the highest possible level. I hope to see a lot of these women at the global stage, not only in very small side events, but really bringing these issues at the highest possible level to raise visibility, and also to focusing a lot, as we said before, on the key elephant in the room, which is finance, but really very much the link between women and finance and gender budgeting, because I believe that only if we really tailor-make that, then we can be part of the solutions, especially if we think that a lot of women, they don't even have, they don't even own the rights of working the lands, although they are the first one that are collecting food, for example, that are working in the agricultural sector. They cannot do much about it. And also if they want to be engaged in projects, very often they cannot, simply because they cannot get the finance in the very first place.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, please.
Well, so I recently had an experience. This summer, I worked with a group of students from the Fletcher School to help Vera Songwa, who was putting together a new study on adaptation finance needs in Africa for the UN Economic Commission on Africa. And it was really important work. She was really spearheading the importance. And one of the things we found, two things we found actually in that work with her was, first thing was that a lot of people were working with the 2017 numbers from countries' nationally determined commitment documents and their national adaptation plans. But so many climatic events and tragedies have happened on the African continent between 2017 and now, that there was like a 40-fold increase in the financing needs of countries in their own assessments since 2017. So something like $400 billion in assessed need versus a much lower number, in the tens of billions back, a decade ago. And the other thing that was really very striking was the disproportionality between the capacity of a country, say like a Kenya, to assess its own needs, or Morocco to assess its own needs, and then East African countries to assess their own needs. And so it looked like the needs in some countries were very low, but that was really probably not because those assessments were correct, but because of the capacity to make the assessments. But then when you look at other, indicating features where you would just, these, lists like the Notre Dame list that show what are the most vulnerable nations to climate events. Of course, those nations we're the ones who are receiving the least funding. And so there really is this disconnect. And Vera, as an African leader, she really understands that well, and really was a leading voice in trying to pull that agenda up to into the leaders' talking points and negotiating platforms for the COP27. So I'm going to ask the audience to tee up some more questions for us. We encourage you to be part of the discussion. But let me ask Catherine and Irina, in your experience, how effective have other organizations, so not the actual national delegations, but other kinds of organizations, whether that's civic organizations, NGOs, activist groups, how effective have they been in bringing more voices into the process? What have you experienced in your activities?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I'll just say, I mean, once again, I mean, I think that many, civic organizations, environmental organizations, organizations involved on climate recognize the importance of bringing women into the process. Although I think there is often a real struggle on bringing a diversity of women. And for a variety of reasons, many of the organizations are Western based. So, you have to actually, have connections. You have to be working on the ground in local communities, and those can be local communities in your own region, or they can be local communities if you're, in Africa, for example, if you're more of a global organization. I think it's getting better. But I mean, I think that's always been a challenge. And I often hear that women, Indigenous women, women of color feel marginalized in these organizations. And so it's just a reminder that it's on everyone. And once again, equality is not just having gender balance. It's making sure you're having a diversity of voices. I would say they're often much better than governments and delegations. But, in some of these countries, it's very hard to actually hear women's voices. I mean, we see women marching on the streets now in Iran and being extraordinarily brave, as well as girls. But you can imagine their formal delegation, or the ability for civil society to go part of their delegation to COP. I mean, I don't know, I guess we'll see. And so I think there are some really significant challenges, but that just shows the importance of bodies like the UN who actually have power. You can say that we expect you to, have 50% women. We are going to help train women, so you can't use that as an excuse. We're going to create a network of women. Now, often this is seen outside the very formal mandate, and there's limited capacity, but I think that's on everyone. And I think there's a lot of reasons why it's hard to do good things, but I think we need to focus on how do you just do them. And having said that, I mean, I will say, just having talked to so many women who are in privileged positions, but they recognize it, and they're actually trying really hard to promote women themselves and to really push. And then, of course, you have movements of women, like Greta or Vanessa in Africa, like they don't care. Like young women come to them. There's probably more young women that are inspired by them. And they're very open. Anyone can participate. Anyone can do a Friday for Futures. Anyone can self-organize. And I think also it's not actually always, or maybe even often, what happens at COP that's the main thing. The main thing is climate action. The main thing is empowering people. The main thing is actually working in your communities. The main thing is recognizing the challenge and working on the opportunities. And that's got to happen at a grassroots local level. So I have to say, that the young women are kind of way ahead of us, because they kind of like, you're just focused on like bean counting, how many people are these COPs? Like, what are COPs even? You know, they're pretty cynical. Now, obviously, I'm not going to diminish the importance of COPs, because, you know, we have real discussions around financing and other issues that are critical to helping women to adapt the impacts of climate change, but also to support action. But in a way, they're onto something, that we need to help support women in local communities. We need to empower them. We need girls on the streets who kind of give no F's, and they're just like, we're going to move on. And they inspire, you know what they inspire? They inspire their parents, including their dads. They inspire their grandparents. I remember my dad said to me, he's like, I don't even understand how, you know, some of my friends, like he's in his 80s, aren't like up in arms about climate change. Like, just talk to their daughters and their kids. And so I think there's a whole level of inspiring, but also just being blunt, because I think we're often very gentle, and we're often like, please, would you let us be at the table? Please, could you incorporate our views? Please, could you do something called a gender-based analysis? And everyone's like, all right, I guess. I don't know if you force us to. We don't know what it means. We're not going to put a lot of effort into it. And so I think it's got to be a little bit less, please, and a little bit more like, we're doing this, and actually we're not asking permission, and we're going to go get support. And I do think there's a lot of allies at the highest level. I mean, the problem is there are always limits on these women's time, but I mean, even on Greta's time, imagine, you know, the commitments. But I think it really is, it's also about men supporting women, and there are a lot of men out there. And so we need to have them on for the ride, and really have them, you know, pushing within their own networks too. And no excuses from, you know, from men about, you know, they've got other priorities. This is the priority. If you empower women, you're going to make more money. You're going to be able to tackle climate action. You're going to make better decisions, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, you know, I'm listening to you, Catherine, I'm remembering an event I was watching virtually. It was an Edinburgh TED Talk. And I won't name names because I'm trying to be gentle, but there were these older generation men on a panel with one young activist woman. And the activists, and I always, you know, in counseling women to be effective in the boardroom and in management, I always tell you, like, if you feel yourself becoming overwhelmed, do not cry in public, you know, go excuse yourself for a moment, calm down, and come back and be forceful. But this young woman was so agitated by what these men were saying about why we have to keep using fossil fuels, that she got upset and angry. And then she started to cry. And when she started to cry, she realized that, like, she just shouldn't be doing this at all, being on a panel with these men. And so she literally took off her microphone and walked off the stage and said, I can't do this. I'm going outside with the other protesters. And the men were like deer in the headlights, like they were unable to respond to what she did. And, you know, I'm sure in their minds, you know, they were just thinking about how inappropriate she behaved. But if you were watching it as the audience, it had such a dramatic effect in undercutting the ridiculousness of what they were saying about why they couldn't take an action, which of course they were all empowered to take concrete actions with finance, like you're saying. They were people who were in control of how to allocate capital for investment in energy. They absolutely could have could shift more billions of dollars into clean energy. And so I thought, ironically, that she was pretty effective. And maybe that's one of the reasons why it's hard to get these young women on the stage, because they are truly confrontational and effective because they understand the issues extremely well.
Well, I have a different view. I'm kind of like, you got to be yourself. I remember being in Parliament and like literally getting yelled at every day because we're bringing a price on pollution. And I would every day say, it is the most conservative approach, and we're doing it in a revenue neutral way. We're giving more money back, so more people are actually putting money in their pockets while being in, you know, creating the incentive. And then one day I just like, and every day I was getting pounded by the other side. Particularly, like, actually the guy who's now the leader of the opposition, like just saying ridiculous things. One day I just got furious. Like, I just lost my shit. And I was like, look, you know what? Why can't you just care about climate change? Why can't you just realize that young people, they've already lived with it? I just went on a complete rant. And then, of course, like the other side, they were like, oh my God, McKenna loses her cool. And they even did, like, of course, attack ads or tweets, whatever. But the outpouring of support, I actually put it out on Twitter because I was like, you know what, I'm done. And the outpouring, well, first of all, I got a note, which was annoying by my side from, like, you know, the people, the staff, they're like, calm down. And I was like, oh, you want me to calm down every day I'm in this place? And so I put out the tweet I put out my video on Twitter because I'm a little bit like, you know what, I don't give a damn anymore. I'm over 50, whatever. I think I started when I was over 40, but I put it out and the outpouring was like, yes, God, yes, damn right, be angry. We're all angry. And so I think we need to just recognize that it's okay to be mad. It's okay to be upset. And that being mansplained day after day by people like, you don't understand, we need an orderly transition, which I keep on hearing. I was like, I don't know, orderly for who? It doesn't look really orderly for most people out there. I think it's okay to be real. You know, I don't suggest every day, you know, you cry because it's very hard to express an argument if you're doing that. But I think it's okay because I think people have to be more emotional about climate change. I mean, we have to be clinical, but certainly reciting science and jargon is really not making the impact we want. So I think that we have to have young women, like the fact they're on the streets and calling it out. There's a role for everyone in this space. And I think they've been extremely powerful. I think that it's actually on the organizers. Like, I'm done. Like, if you can't find half women on a panel, and these days, like, call me up. I got so many binders. And it's so I think it's not even fair. Like, in a way, as you say, it's not fair that young woman was put in that position. Yes. But I think, as you say, it was probably way more powerful because then everyone, instead of just listening to the same old blah, blah, they were like, oh, yeah, this is real.
It did go viral.
We got to change the paradigm here, overthrow the regime a bit. And I'm someone who, you know, look, I get it. We got to all work together, but sometimes you got to have a real wake up call, and we need transformative systems change. And it's not going to get done if everyone's just saying the same thing and it's the same dudes who are saying it.
Maybe so, just to add into
sorry to rant. That was a bit ranty.
Yeah, no, it's great. Irina, making your point, but
yeah,
add for us
to what Catherine was saying, because I think that, yeah, women don't have just to stay to protest and be definitely, you know, on the streets. And I think they definitely need also a space to make their point at places like the COP. Very often, I mean, let's be honest here, it's very difficult for them to be there to gain the access, but also the finance to get to the COPs, I think, is difficult. So I'm just thinking one way that made their life easier was definitely the virtual participation. And just replying to one question that was in the chat, what kind of organization do concretely for women to make their voice heard, especially for young women? And when it comes to SE for All, we have a specific programs, women and youth on the forefront. And what we try to do is definitely focus on networking for them, having specifically mentoring activities, but also attracting them to the COP, because this is where their voice should be heard. So we managed to have this year 10 women from across the globe. So not only from Sub-Saharan Africa, but also from Asia Pacific, from Haiti and many other different countries. And each of them, it's an energy expert on a different field, ranging from clean cooking to engineers, renewables, wind, solar, you name it. They're young, but they're passionate. And I think it's very important for their passion to be listened, to be heard also at the global stage at the COP, and not only during the protest on the street. And yeah, so this will happen on Gender Day, and we will also have a networking event for them and trying to connect leaders from the sectors, from the energy sectors, with young leaders to have a meaningful conversation, because what we discussed before was very much about networking rights. And I think this is very important for us. And that is what we're trying to do with this program, with women and youth at the forefront.
So Irina, are there programs also that bring that education and knowledge that you're talking about existing in these networks to communities poor communities and indigenous communities to help them understand what the tools are and how to make their voices more heard? Are there programs like that as well?
We do. We work with the student energy, for example, on doing that. We work with local activists. We have a specific area on youth. We have a youth specialist, actually, that is working with the local communities to raise awareness. And we do training, and we work very closely with the local communities. And in our programs, we work in areas which are remote. So we try to really bring forward the knowledge and the expertise of the locals in our projects. So we definitely do that. And also another element where we are very active is with the United Nations that you were mentioning before, is the UN Gender Energy Compact that put together civil society, grassroots organization, also from indigenous people, as well as governments and companies as well, to discuss about the importance of gender in the energy sector.
And would you say, I mean, maybe you don't want to answer the question in quite this way, but maybe I'm not let me think of how to answer it correctly. I mean, do you think the UN bodies are doing enough and in this to support that kind of activity? And do you need to see more support from some of the big countries like China or the United States or the EU? Do you feel the presence and the momentum coming to you from the big climate powers, so to speak, or you feel like it needs more attention?
I definitely think that the European Union, the US, and also China, especially China, they should play a much more proactive role during negotiation and underline the importance of gender equality in all aspects, not only on the climate dimension, but also on the energy dimension. And one thing that I want to underline is that we focus a lot about climate negotiations, but we have to look into the energy dimension as well, because first of all, the energy sector is the sector where most of the greenhouse gas emissions are coming from, the power sector, and also is the sector where mostly dominated by men. There are only 13.9% of women in decision making. And those are changing how things are designed. So I will say two things: definitely much more prominent role from these three actors, China, EU, and US, as you mentioned, Amy, but also much more prominent role for those women that are leading in the energy sector to be much more visible and to raise awareness on the fact that the energy sector is still male dominated. And if we don't do anything about it, it will be as such for the next 100 years. So we rather do something about it right now.
Well, I think I'm going to take the opportunity, since we're out of time, to really end on that point. I want to thank you, Irina, and also Catherine, for really invigorating our conversation today on this topic. Again, if you're interested, on the Center for Global Energy Policy website, we have a policy discussion paper that shows you the academic research behind the things that Catherine and Irina were discussing. We do also at the Women Energy Program have other publications about how to enhance the role of women in the energy sector globally. And we have a great paper on the role of women as localized energy producers, and other work on how in the corporate sector, the role of the board in advancing inclusion and diversity in a culture in corporations. So again, thank you to our two panelists today. And as we mentioned, the full video recording of this event will be available on the Center on Global Energy Policy's website in a few days. Our next event, Chinese Climate Policy, will be held later today at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Let's ask them about China's commitment to some of the topics we've been discussing today. And for those of you who will be in Sharm el-Sheikh during COP27, we encourage you to join us for our events there, our center events there. There's a full calendar of upcoming events is available online. And we hope to see you there. And also we hope to see you at a future event soon. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, bye.
Thank you. I would just say, check out Women Leading on Climate coming to Columbia next year. So there's going to be a lot going on. Yeah, don't worry, you're going to be involved. Both of you.
Love
Thank
it.
you. Bye.
Bye.